Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving deep into a story that completely reshaped history, yet many people have never even heard of it. We're talking about a moment when an African nation stared down a European colonial power and didn't just win. They scored a decisive, world-shaking victory. This is the story of the Battle of Adwa. Let's set the stage. It's the late 19th century, the height of the scramble for Africa. European powers are carving up the continent like a pie, driven by ambition, resources, and a sense of racial superiority. Italy, a relatively new nation itself, was desperate to join the colonial club and build its own empire. They had their eyes set on the Horn of Africa, specifically Ethiopia, one of the only African nations, along with Liberia, to have maintained its independence. Ethiopia wasn't just any kingdom. It was an ancient empire with a rich history stretching back thousands of years, a unique Christian tradition, and a fierce sense of national pride. At the helm was Emperor Menelik II, a brilliant strategist, modernizer, and diplomat. Alongside him was his wife, the formidable Empress Teitu Batul, a shrewd political operator and military advisor in her own right. She was fiercely anti-colonial and played a crucial role in rallying the nation. So, how did this conflict start? It all began with a piece of paper, the Treaty of Wuchale, signed in 1889. The treaty was supposed to define the relationship between Italy and Ethiopia. Here's the catch. It was written in two languages, Amharic and Italian, and the two versions said different things. The Amharic version, which Menelik signed, stated that Ethiopia could use Italy's help for foreign relations if they wanted to. But the Italian version, Article 17, stated that Ethiopia must conduct all its foreign affairs through Italy, effectively making it an Italian protectorate. When Menelik discovered this deception, he was furious. He tried to negotiate, to find a peaceful solution, but the Italians were adamant. They saw this as their legal claim to the country. Menelik knew what this meant. He famously wrote to the European powers, "Ethiopia has need of no one. She stretches out her hands unto God." The message was clear: we will not be colonized. He began preparing for the inevitable war. Menelik was a forward thinker. He spent years importing modern weapons, rifles, cannons, and ammunition from France and Russia, playing European rivalries against each other to his advantage. He wasn't just building an army, he was building a modern army. But his greatest weapon was the unity of his people. He issued a proclamation, a call to arms that resonated through the mountains and valleys of Ethiopia. It was a powerful appeal to every man, woman, and child to defend their land, their faith, and their freedom. And the people answered. From all corners of the vast empire, regional leaders, or raisers, put aside their own rivalries and marched with their soldiers to join the emperor's forces. It was an unprecedented display of national unity. Tens of thousands of warriors, from farmers to noblemen, gathered under the Ethiopian flag. This wasn't just Menelik's army, it was the nation itself on the march. Meanwhile, the Italians were growing increasingly confident and arrogant. Their commander, General Baratieri, was under immense pressure from Rome to deliver a swift, glorious victory. He underestimated the Ethiopians at every turn. He dismissed them as a disorganized, poorly equipped tribal force that would crumble at the first sign of a modern European army. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The Italian forces pushed deeper into Ethiopian territory, setting up a fortified position in the Tigray region. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and their intelligence was poor. They had local informants, but many were actually double agents feeding them false information, a brilliant tactic orchestrated by the Ethiopians. The two armies converged near a town called Adwa. The Ethiopian force was massive, numbering around 100,000 soldiers. The Italian force was much smaller, about 17,000 men, though they were confident their superior training and technology would carry the day. For weeks, the two armies faced off in a tense standoff. Menelik, a patient commander, wanted to choose his moment. His army was running low on supplies, and he knew he couldn't wait forever. General Baratieri was in an even worse position. His men were on half rations, and the pressure from Rome was mounting. He received a telegram goading him, questioning his courage. Against his better judgment, and based on faulty intelligence that the Ethiopians were about to disperse, Baratieri decided to launch a surprise attack. On the night of February 29, 1896, under the cover of darkness, he ordered his troops to advance. His plan was to occupy the high ground and surprise the Ethiopian camp at dawn. The plan was complex, involving 3 separate columns advancing through treacherous, unfamiliar terrain in the middle of the night. It was a recipe for disaster. The columns got lost. They got separated. One brigade marched straight into another, causing chaos and confusion in the dark. As the sun rose on March 1st, the Italians were not in their strategic positions. Instead, they were scattered, exhausted, and completely exposed in the valleys around Adwa. And the Ethiopians were waiting. Their lookouts had spotted the Italian advance. Empress Teitu herself had been instrumental in positioning scouts and gathering intelligence. The signal was given, and the Ethiopian army, which the Italians thought was on the verge of collapse, descended from the surrounding hills like a tidal wave. The battle was ferocious. The Ethiopian warriors, chanting war cries and led by Menelik, Teitu, and their commanders from the front, charged with incredible courage. They knew the terrain intimately, using every hill and ravine to their advantage. The Italian soldiers, disoriented and outnumbered, fought bravely but were quickly overwhelmed. One Italian brigade was completely annihilated early on. Another was surrounded and forced into a desperate fight for survival. The Italian artillery was effective at first, but the Ethiopian forces were relentless. They closed the distance, turning the battle into a brutal, close-quarters fight where their sheer numbers and fighting spirit were overwhelming. Emperor Menelik himself was in the heart of the battle, directing his troops from his command post near a church. Empress Teitu commanded her own personal reserve of 6,000 soldiers, holding them back until the perfect moment to commit them to the fight, plugging gaps and turning the tide in critical sectors. By midday, it was all over. The Italian army was not just defeated, it was shattered. It was a complete and total rout. The survivors fled in panic, hunted for miles by the victorious Ethiopians. The scale of the Italian loss was staggering. Thousands killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It was the single worst defeat a European colonial power had ever suffered in Africa. The news of the victory at Adwa sent shockwaves across the globe. In Italy, the government collapsed. Riots broke out in the streets. General Baratieri was court-martialed. The dream of an Italian East African empire was left in ruins. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, which unequivocally recognized the absolute independence of Ethiopia. But the impact went far beyond Ethiopia and Italy. For people of African descent all over the world, in the Caribbean, in the United States, everywhere where they were living under colonialism and racial oppression, Adwa was a thunderclap. It was proof that the myth of European invincibility was just that, a myth. It became a symbol of black pride, resistance, and the dream of self-determination. It inspired early Pan-Africanist movements and fueled anti-colonial struggles for decades to come. The Battle of Adwa is more than just a military victory. It's a testament to the power of unity, brilliant leadership, and the unbreakable will of a people to remain free. It secured Ethiopia's sovereignty and created a beacon of hope that shone across a colonized continent. It's a story that deserves to be told, remembered, and celebrated. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical events you'd like to see covered. See you next time. The sound shattered the illusion of control. Italian soldiers scrambled to form lines, dragging artillery into position as bullets whistled from unseen heights. Ethiopian forces attacked with precision, striking from ridges and slopes, using elevation as a weapon. Every step the Italians took forward exposed them further. Every attempt to regroup was met with relentless pressure. Panic crept in, not sudden, but creeping, like frost spreading across glass. For Ethiopian fighters, this was not just a tactical engagement. It was deeply personal. Many had seen neighboring lands swallowed by colonial rule. They had heard stories of forced labor, broken kings, erased cultures. They knew what defeat would mean. So they fought with a fire that no drill or salary could inspire. Farmers became soldiers. Priests carried rifles. Warriors charged with cries that echoed through the valleys, not of hatred, but of defiance. And still, the Italians underestimated them. They could not understand how an African army was maneuvering so effectively, how attacks were coordinated across vast distances, how reserves appeared exactly where they were needed. What they failed to grasp was that this unity had been forged long before the battlefield, through diplomacy, shared purpose, and a collective refusal to be erased. Ethiopia was not improvising. It was executing a vision years in the making. As the sun climbed higher, the separation of Italian columns became a death sentence. One unit engaged heavily, another lost and wandering, a third overwhelmed before it could properly deploy. Attempts to support one another failed. Signals were missed. Orders arrived too late. The battlefield dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance, each fighting a battle it could not win alone. From the heights overlooking Adwa, Ethiopian commanders watched the plan unfold, not with celebration, but with grim focus. This was working, but victory would still demand blood. And blood was being paid in full. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the cries of the wounded. The ground trembled under the movement of men and artillery. History was no longer waiting. It was happening. By midday, the truth was undeniable. The Italian offensive had collapsed into chaos. What was meant to be a surprise attack had become a desperate struggle for survival. Officers fought bravely, some dying beside their men, but bravery could not undo the fundamental error. They had walked into a battle they did not understand, against a people they had fatally underestimated. And as Ethiopian forces pressed their advantage, surrounding and breaking resistance piece by piece, a realization began to dawn, not just among the Italians, but across the future of global power. Africa was not weak. Africa was not waiting to be conquered. Africa was fighting back, and winning. But the most shocking moments were still to come. Because by the end of this day, an empire would fall to its knees, and the world would be forced to confront an impossible truth it had tried for centuries to deny. By mid-morning, the mountains no longer watched in silence, they roared. Gunfire echoed endlessly through the highlands, bouncing from ridge to ridge until it sounded like the earth itself was at war. Smoke curled upward, blurring the sky, while dust rose from thousands of pounding feet. What had begun as a calculated Ethiopian response was now transforming into something far greater, a complete unraveling of imperial confidence. The Italian army, once so certain of its superiority, was fighting not just an enemy, but panic, confusion, and the terrifying realization that history had turned against them. At the heart of the battlefield, Ethiopian forces surged with relentless coordination. This was not a single wave of attack, but a living, breathing system of movement. When one unit pressed forward, another flanked. When ammunition ran low in one position, runners appeared with fresh supplies. Horns and signals carried commands across distances Europeans believed impossible to control without telegraphs or radios. To Italian officers, it felt supernatural, like fighting shadows that struck with precision and vanished into the land. Leading this orchestration was Menelik II, watching from a strategic vantage point. His face, witnesses later said, carried no triumph, only gravity. Every report he received confirmed what he already understood. This was the decisive hour. If discipline held, Ethiopia would secure not just victory, but immortality. If it broke, the cost would be catastrophic. He sent reinforcements where pressure mounted and held back reserves where patience could win more than aggression. Not far from him stood a force often left out of battlefield legends, women moving through the chaos with purpose. At their head was Empress II, commanding logistical lines, ensuring water reached fighters, urging resistance where morale wavered. Her presence was not symbolic, it was strategic. She understood that wars were not won by weapons alone, but by endurance, and Ethiopia had more endurance than Italy could ever imagine. On the Italian side, desperation spread like wildfire. Separated columns attempted to regroup, only to collide with Ethiopian units emerging from unexpected directions. Artillery crews fought fiercely but were quickly overwhelmed as Ethiopian fighters closed distances the Italians believed safe. Modern rifles jammed in dust and panic. Orders contradicted one another. Officers shouted commands that dissolved into noise. In moments meant for control, chaos took command instead. Some Italian soldiers fought bravely to the end. Others fled in terror. Many simply froze, unable to comprehend how the script had flipped so completely. They had been told this would be a demonstration of European might, a lesson delivered to Africa. Instead, they were the ones being taught a lesson, written in blood and humiliation. The land itself seemed to choose sides. Italian troops attempting to retreat found paths blocked by cliffs and ravines. Ethiopian fighters, moving lightly and deliberately, used elevation as a weapon, firing downward, charging upward with terrifying speed. From above, the battlefield looked less like a clash of armies and more like a storm swallowing steel. The proud formations of Europe disintegrated into scattered pockets of resistance, each fighting alone against a force that fought as one. By early afternoon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Italian commanders realized the truth too late. They had not underestimated Ethiopia's weapons, They had underestimated Ethiopia's mind. This was not luck. This was preparation. This was intelligence. This was unity. Every colonial assumption about race, discipline, and capability collapsed under the weight of undeniable reality. As news of the disaster spread across the battlefield, surrender flags appeared in some sectors. In others, desperate last stands played out against impossible odds. Ethiopian forces showed no mercy in combat, but neither did they descend into chaos. Prisoners were taken. Weapons were seized. Control was maintained. Even in victory, discipline held. And then, as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the highlands near Adwa, something extraordinary happened. Silence. Not complete silence, but the kind that follows revelation. The gunfire slowed. The shouting faded. What remained was the sound of wind brushing over the mountains and the heavy breathing of men who knew they had witnessed something impossible. An African army had annihilated a European force. Not in legend. Not in myth. But in full view of the modern world. The implications rippled far beyond the battlefield. This was not just Italy's defeat, it was a crack in the foundation of empire itself. From colonized lands across Africa and the diaspora beyond, the message would soon spread like fire. Europe was not invincible. But victory, as Ethiopia was about to learn, carried its own weight. Because the world would not forgive this humiliation easily. And the consequences of Adwa would echo far beyond the mountains, into diplomacy, revenge, and a future where victory itself would be tested. The battle was over, but the earthquake it triggered had only just begun. As the last echoes of gunfire faded across the mountains near Adwa, a strange stillness settled over the land. The ground was littered with shattered rifles, torn uniforms, and the unspoken truth of defeat. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky, as if the mountains themselves were exhaling after a long-held breath. Ethiopian warriors stood among the remnants of a fallen imperial force, not cheering wildly, not dancing in triumph, but absorbing the magnitude of what they had done, because they understood something the world had not yet realized. This victory would change everything. Word of the disaster spread quickly through the surviving Italian ranks. Messengers fled toward the coast, carrying stories no one in Europe was prepared to hear. An expedition meant to glorify an empire had ended in humiliation. Thousands were dead, captured, or missing. Entire units had vanished into the highlands. The idea of European invincibility, carefully cultivated for centuries, had been shattered by an African army fighting on its own terms. Back in Italy, the news landed like a thunderclap. Newspapers struggled to explain it. Editors softened language. Politicians shifted blame. Generals spoke of bad maps, poor guides, unfortunate terrain, anything except the truth. Crowds gathered in disbelief, reading headlines again and again, convinced there must be some mistake. How could a modern European army lose so completely? How could this happen in Africa, of all places? There were protests. There was outrage. There was shame. Italy's dream of colonial glory had collapsed in a single day. Meanwhile, in the Ethiopian camp, victory was treated not as an ending, but as a responsibility. Menelik II did not order reckless celebration. He ordered restraint. Prisoners were gathered. Wounded Italians were treated. Discipline was enforced. This was deliberate. Menelik understood that the next battle would not be fought with rifles, but with reputation. The world was watching now, and Ethiopia had to show not only strength, but wisdom. Among the prisoners were officers who could scarcely meet their captors' eyes. Some expected revenge. Others expected execution. What they encountered instead was something deeply unsettling: dignity. It confused them. It challenged everything they had been taught to believe about Africa and Africans. The psychological impact of that realization would haunt survivors long after they returned home. But the shockwaves did not stop in Europe. Across Africa, though news traveled slowly, the story of Adwa moved like a whispered prayer. In colonized lands where resistance had been crushed, where people had been told their defeat was inevitable, a dangerous new idea took root: empire could be beaten. From the savannas to the forests, from coastal towns to inland villages, Adwa became more than a battle. It became a symbol. Hope is a powerful weapon. In churches and royal courts across Ethiopia, Thanksgiving prayers were offered. Bells rang. Songs were sung that would be passed down through generations. Elders told children, "You must remember this day." Not because war was glorious, but because freedom had been defended when it mattered most. Ethiopia had not survived by accident. It had survived by unity, sacrifice, and foresight. Yet beneath the pride, there was also tension. Menelik knew Europe would not forget this humiliation. Empires rarely forgive those who expose their weakness. Diplomatic pressure began almost immediately. Foreign envoys arrived with careful smiles and cautious words. Treaties were reconsidered. Borders were discussed. Recognition was negotiated. Ethiopia had won the war, but now it had to secure the peace. And that peace came at a price. International recognition followed, but so did isolation. Ethiopia remained independent, yes, but surrounded by colonial territories controlled by suspicious powers. The victory at Adwa made Ethiopia a beacon, but also a target. Menelik had to balance defiance with diplomacy, strength with restraint. One misstep could invite retaliation disguised as negotiation. In Europe, military academies quietly rewrote their manuals. Colonial officers studied the battle not as a failure of courage, but as a lesson in arrogance. They would not underestimate again. Adwa forced empire to adapt, and adaptation, too, can be dangerous. Still, no revision could erase the truth. An African nation had defended itself successfully against a European empire at the height of colonial expansion. Not through luck, not through chaos, but through strategy, unity, and resolve. The story could not be undone, no matter how carefully it was buried under excuses. As the years passed, Adwa would become a reference point, spoken aloud by some, whispered by others. For the oppressed, it was proof. For the powerful, it was a warning. And for Ethiopia, it was a crown earned in blood, discipline, and courage. But history is rarely satisfied with one act, because decades later, the same empire would return, older, angrier, and determined to erase the memory of humiliation. And when it did, Adwa would be remembered not just as a victory, but as a promise. History has a cruel habit of pretending wounds heal just because time passes. But humiliation, especially the kind witnessed at Adwa, does not fade, it waits. Beneath the surface of European diplomacy, beneath polite treaties and forced smiles, Italy carried a scar it could not erase. The Battle of Adwa was not just a defeat, it was an insult written into the soul of an empire that believed itself destined to rule. 4 years after 1896, Italy struggled to reconcile the truth. Official statements spoke of temporary setbacks and strategic errors, but within military circles, Adwa was studied obsessively. Officers pored over maps, reports, and survivor testimonies, searching for a way to undo history. The lesson they took was not humility, it was vengeance. The belief grew quietly but steadily. One day, Ethiopia would pay. Meanwhile, Ethiopia stood as an anomaly in a continent rapidly falling under colonial rule. Surrounded by European possessions, Ethiopia remained defiantly independent. This independence came at a cost. Trade routes were restricted. Diplomacy was tense. Suspicion followed every foreign advisor and envoy. Victory had secured sovereignty, but it also painted a target on Ethiopia's back. At the center of this uneasy balance was Menelik II, now older, heavier with responsibility, and acutely aware that Adwa was both shield and provocation. He modernized cautiously, building infrastructure, strengthening diplomacy, and acquiring weapons not for conquest, but deterrence. Menelik understood that Ethiopia could not rely on past glory alone. The world was changing, and empires were learning. Yet Italy never truly moved on. As decades passed, Italy's political landscape transformed. Economic frustration, wounded national pride, and dreams of restored greatness created fertile ground for extremism. Into this atmosphere stepped a man who would weaponize memory itself, Benito Mussolini. To him, Adwa was not ancient history, it was unfinished business, a stain on Italy's honor that demanded erasure. Mussolini promised a reborn Roman Empire. He promised glory, dominance, and revenge. And at the heart of his vision was Ethiopia. In his speeches, Adwa became propaganda, a symbol of what Italy had lost and what it must reclaim. The story was rewritten, twisted into a narrative of betrayal and injustice. The Ethiopian victory was framed not as legitimate resistance, but as a humiliation that must be corrected. Fascism thrives on grievance, and Adwa provided the perfect one. By the early 1930s, the drums of war began to beat again. Italy rearmed aggressively. Roads, airfields, and supply lines were constructed in neighboring colonies. The scale of preparation dwarfed the earlier invasion. This time, Italy would not rely solely on rifles and artillery. It would bring tanks, aircraft, and, most chillingly, chemical weapons. The lesson Italy believed it had learned from Adwa was simple: never allow Ethiopia to fight on equal terms again. In Ethiopia, the warning signs were clear. Emperor Haile Selassie, Menelik's successor, watched the build-up with growing alarm. Diplomatic appeals were sent to Europe. Treaties were cited. International law was invoked. Ethiopia had followed the rules of the so-called civilized world. It had joined global institutions. It believed recognition would bring protection. It was wrong. When the second invasion came in 1935, it was brutal, merciless, and deliberately disproportionate. Italian forces dropped poison gas on soldiers and civilians alike. Villages burned. Crops were destroyed. The aim was not just conquest, but erasure. Mussolini wanted to do what his predecessors could not: crush the memory of Adwa under overwhelming force. And yet, even in defeat, Adwa refused to die. Ethiopian resistance persisted. Patriots fought from mountains and forests. Songs of the 1896 victory were sung in whispers. Adwa became a reminder of what had once been achieved, and what could one day be achieved again. The Italians occupied territory, but they never fully conquered the Ethiopian spirit. International outrage followed, but action did not. The world condemned Italy in words, then looked away. Ethiopia stood nearly alone, paying the price for having once humiliated an empire. And still, the legacy of Adwa endured. Because the battle had already done its most important work, not by preventing future violence, but by planting an unkillable idea. An idea that colonial domination was not destiny, that unity could defeat power, that Africa's history did not begin with conquest and would not end with it. Adwa had taught the world something dangerous, and no amount of bombs, gas, or occupation could ever unteach it. A battle does not end when the last shot is fired. Some battles refuse to stay buried in the soil where they were fought. They travel across oceans, across generations, across minds that have never seen the battlefield itself. Adwa was one of those battles. Long after the smoke cleared in the Ethiopian highlands, its spirit slipped quietly into the world, changing people who had never heard the crack of a rifle near Adwa. At first, the story moved slowly, almost secretly. In a world dominated by European-controlled newspapers, Adwa was inconvenient. Editors downplayed it. Textbooks minimized it. Colonial officials avoided mentioning it at all. But stories have a way of escaping cages. Sailors spoke in ports. Missionaries whispered in churches. Traders carried rumors inland. And wherever oppressed people gathered, the same question began to surface. Is it true? Did an African army really defeat a European empire? The answer, yes, changed everything. Across colonized Africa, Adwa became a forbidden reference point. Colonial authorities sensed its danger instinctively. They discouraged discussion of Ethiopia. They mocked the victory as a fluke. They warned against false hope. But hope, once awakened, is stubborn. In West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, young men and women began to see resistance not as suicide, but as possibility. Adwa had proven that power could be challenged, not just morally, but militarily. In Ethiopia, this realization came with weight. Ethiopians understood they carried a responsibility far beyond their borders. Independence was no longer just theirs. It symbolized what Africa could be. This awareness shaped diplomacy, culture, and identity. Ethiopia became more than a nation. It became an idea, a living counterargument to colonial ideology. That idea crossed the ocean. In the Caribbean and the Americas, descendants of enslaved Africans lived under systems that told them daily that black people had never ruled themselves successfully. Adwa shattered that lie. Ethiopian independence, defended by force and intelligence, offered historical proof that Africa was not a continent waiting to be civilized, but one that had been resisting all along. Black newspapers in the United States wrote about Ethiopia with reverence. Churches prayed for its safety. Intellectuals pointed to Adwa as evidence against racist pseudoscience. For people denied dignity by law and custom, Ethiopia became a mirror of what had been stolen and what could still be reclaimed. This was why Ethiopia occupied such a powerful place in black consciousness worldwide. It was not fantasy. It was fact. When Italy invaded again in the 1930s, the reaction was global. Protests erupted in cities far from Africa. Donations were raised. volunteers attempted to travel to defend Ethiopia. Songs, poems, and speeches invoked Adwa, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder of what had once been achieved against impossible odds. The second invasion hurt so deeply precisely because it felt like an attempt to murder a symbol. And symbols do not die quietly. Even during occupation, Adwa lived on in whispered stories and coded language. Ethiopian patriots invoked the names of past heroes before battle. Elders reminded children that empires rise and fall, but memory survives. Adwa was not just a past victory, it was a promise deferred, waiting to be fulfilled again. When Italy was finally driven out during World War II, Ethiopia's restoration resonated far beyond its borders. It was not simply liberation, it was vindication. The empire that had returned for revenge had fallen again, this time exposed as brutal and desperate. The myth of European moral superiority cracked further, and through those cracks poured new movements. Pan-Africanism grew stronger. Anti-colonial leaders cited Ethiopia as inspiration. Adwa was no longer a single event. It was a reference point in global resistance history. From political speeches to classroom discussions, it quietly reoriented how the world understood Africa's past and future. Yet the most powerful legacy of Adwa was not in slogans or ceremonies. It was internal. It lived in the knowledge that unity, real unity across ethnic, regional, and political lines, could defeat even the most technologically advanced enemy. Adwa taught that preparation matters, that intelligence matters, that dignity is a weapon as real as any rifle. These lessons would echo in liberation struggles across the 20th century, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes unspoken, but always present. The battle had traveled far without armies. It had crossed borders without passports. It had ignited courage without commands. It had proven that history could be interrupted. And still, one final question remained, one that history continues to wrestle with. If Adwa proved what was possible, why was Africa still colonized for so long afterward? The answer lies not in the battlefield, but in the cost of sustaining freedom in a world built to deny it. Adwa proved the impossible, but it did not change the rules of the world. That is the uncomfortable truth history often avoids. The Battle of Adwa shattered the myth of European invincibility, yet across Africa, colonial flags continued to rise. Empires adjusted, adapted, and hardened. They learned from defeat. They did not abandon domination, they refined it. And in that refinement lay the reason Adwa, as powerful as it was, could not liberate a continent by itself. Victory is loud. Freedom is quiet and expensive to maintain. In the years after 1896, Ethiopia stood independent but isolated. European powers recognized its sovereignty not out of respect, but calculation. Ethiopia was useful as a buffer, as a symbol to be managed, not a model to be replicated. Diplomacy wrapped control in politeness. Trade agreements replaced chains. Influence replaced occupation. The battlefield had moved, and many did not notice. For other African societies, Adwa was inspiring, but inspiration without resources is fragile. Colonized peoples lacked what Ethiopia had at that moment: a centralized state, recognized leadership, diplomatic leverage, and the ability to stockpile modern weapons legally. Resistance movements elsewhere faced overwhelming retaliation. Entire communities were punished for rebellion. Colonial powers learned that fear, applied systematically, could smother hope before it became organization. Adwa had shown what unity could achieve, but unity is rare under pressure. Ethiopia itself was not immune to this challenge. The unity that had carried Menelik's forces to victory required constant negotiation afterward. Ethnic diversity, regional interests, and political ambition did not disappear after the battle. Holding a nation together in peace proved as complex as mobilizing it for war. The lesson was painful but clear. Unity forged in crisis must be deliberately maintained, or it fades. And yet, the memory of Adwa refused to weaken. It endured because it was grounded in reality, not myth. This was not a story of supernatural victory. It was a story of planning, intelligence, and collective will. That made it dangerous to those who benefited from hierarchy. Colonial education systems deliberately minimized such examples. Children were taught European triumphs, not African victories. Silence became another tool of empire. Still, silence failed. Adwa survived in oral history, in cultural memory, in identity. For Ethiopians, it was proof of worth. For Africans beyond Ethiopia, it was proof of possibility. And for the African diaspora, it was proof that history had been edited, not written honestly. This is why Adwa frightened power, because it revealed that dominance was not natural, it was engineered. And what is engineered can be dismantled. Throughout the 20th century, as independence movements gathered strength, Adwa resurfaced again and again, sometimes explicitly, sometimes indirectly. Leaders spoke of dignity, self-rule, and preparedness. They emphasized unity across divisions. They warned against underestimating the enemy. These were not abstract ideas. They were lessons learned from Ethiopia's stand. But Adwa also carried a warning. Victory alone does not end oppression. It only opens the door. What walks through that door depends on what follows. When Ethiopia was invaded again decades later, the world's failure to act revealed the limits of symbolic victories. Power respects strength, but it also respects consistency. Freedom must be defended repeatedly, not remembered passively. Adwa taught this truth harshly. Humiliating an empire once does not stop it from returning stronger, angrier, and less restrained. And yet, without Adwa, the world would have been poorer. Because without Adwa, there would be no undeniable proof that Africa could resist successfully in the age of empire. Without Adwa, racist theories would have stood taller. Without Adwa, countless movements might have lacked the courage to try it all. Adwa did not end colonialism, but it weakened its foundation. It exposed the lie beneath the system. It forced empire to reveal its fear. It proved that the oppressed were not powerless, only constrained. As the chapter of direct colonial rule eventually closed across Africa, Adwa remained, a quiet witness to the truth that freedom is never given, only defended. Its lesson continues to challenge every generation that inherits it. What will you do with proof that victory is possible? Because history does not reward memory alone. It rewards action. Some battles age into museum pieces, neatly labeled, safely distant, stripped of urgency. Adwa is not one of them. More than a century later, it still breathes. It still unsettles. It still asks uncomfortable questions of the present. The Battle of Adwa refuses to be history alone because the forces it confronted, arrogance, domination, erasure, never truly disappeared. Today, when Ethiopians speak of Adwa, they do not speak only of 1896. They speak of identity, of survival, of a moment when the world tried to define them and failed. The mountains where rifles once cracked have become symbols of memory, visited not just with pride, but with responsibility. Because remembering Adwa is not about celebration. It is about understanding what it took to stand firm when surrender seemed inevitable. In modern Ethiopia, Adwa remains a foundation stone of national consciousness. School children learn its names. Elders recount its sacrifices. Artists, musicians, and writers reinterpret its meaning for new generations. Yet even here, the lesson is complex. Adwa was a moment of unity, but unity, as history shows, is fragile. The same divisions that once threatened Ethiopia's survival can still return if memory is treated as ornament rather than obligation. Globally, Adwa's message feels eerily current. The language of empire has changed, but its structures remain. Control no longer always arrives with armies. It comes through debt, influence, extraction, and narrative power. Countries are pressured rather than invaded. Cultures are reshaped rather than erased outright. And once again, the question echoes: who controls the story and who pays the price? Adwa challenges modern audiences because it refuses simple interpretation. It is not a fairy tale where courage alone guarantees justice. It is a reminder that preparation matters, leadership matters, and unity is an active choice, not a natural state. Ethiopia did not win because it was lucky. It won because it planned, negotiated, adapted, and understood its enemy better than the enemy understood it. That lesson extends far beyond Africa. For communities facing marginalization, Adwa offers a blueprint, not for violence, but for agency. It teaches that dignity must be defended intellectually as well as physically. That representation matters. That silence can be as dangerous as submission. And that power fears nothing more than people who understand both themselves and the systems they face. In the African diaspora, Adwa still resonates as a corrective to a historical erasure. It stands against narratives that begin Africa's story with enslavement or colonization. It insists on a longer memory, one that includes sovereignty, strategy, and victory. This is why Adwa appears in classrooms, speeches, and cultural movements even today. It fills a gap that history books once left intentionally blank. But Adwa also demands honesty. It asks whether modern societies are honoring the unity that made such victories possible, or merely invoking the past while repeating old mistakes. It questions whether independence has been matched with justice, whether sovereignty has translated into dignity for all, and whether memory has been used as guidance rather than decoration. Because the greatest betrayal of Adwa would be to remember it loudly and live its lesson quietly. The battle teaches that freedom is not a single event. It is a practice. It requires vigilance, discipline, and the courage to confront internal fractures as fiercely as external threats. Adwa succeeded because Ethiopians chose collective survival over individual ambition, even temporarily. That choice remains as relevant now as it was in 1896. And so, Adwa endures, not as a relic, not as a slogan, but as a challenge. A challenge to any people told they are too weak to resist. A challenge to any system built on presumed superiority. A challenge to every generation that inherits proof of possibility and must decide what to do with it. The mountains of Adwa still stand. They have watched empires rise and fall. They have seen victory, vengeance, silence, and return. And they are still watching, waiting to see whether the lesson paid for in blood will be remembered as history or used as instruction. The sun rose over Adwa the same way it always had, slowly, patiently, without ceremony. Light spilled across jagged peaks and narrow valleys, touching stones that had known centuries of footsteps, prayers, and blood. Birds called. Wind moved through grass. To the land, it was just another morning. But to history, it was the moment everything changed, the moment the world crossed a line it could never step back over. This was the morning when an empire learned that power is not destiny. When we ask what it truly means to humiliate an empire, the answer is not found in casualties or captured weapons. Empires lose battles all the time. What Italy lost at Adwa was something far more dangerous: authority. The authority to claim inevitability. The authority to speak of superiority as fact. The authority to tell the world, resistance is useless. That authority died in the highlands of Adwa. For Italy, the humiliation cut deep because it was public, undeniable, and irreversible. No treaty language could soften it. No propaganda could fully bury it. The empire had come with maps, medals, and modern weapons, and left behind disbelief. Italy did not just lose control of a battlefield, it lost control of the story it told about itself and the world. And stories are the true currency of power. At the center of that shattered narrative stood Menelik II, not raising his fist in triumph, not declaring dominance, but standing as proof that leadership rooted in patience, unity, and intelligence could outmaneuver arrogance. Menelik did not seek to destroy Italy. He sought to protect Ethiopia. And in doing so, he exposed the fragility of empires built on assumption rather than understanding. That exposure was the real humiliation. Because once the world saw that a European empire could be defeated by an African nation on equal terms, the colonial project could never again claim moral or historical inevitability. It could only rely on force. And force, when stripped of justification, reveals itself for what it truly is. Adwa did not scream its lesson. It whispered it, and the whisper traveled farther than any cannon. Across Africa, across the diaspora, across generations, the meaning of that morning took root. Not as a call to endless war, but as a reminder that dignity is not granted by recognition. It is defended by resolve. That preparation matters more than bravado. That unity is not a slogan, but a strategy. This is why Adwa still matters. Because the modern world still struggles with the same temptation empires always face, to confuse power with right, dominance with destiny, technology with truth. Adwa stands as a permanent interruption to that thinking, a historical footnote that refuses to stay small, a reminder that those written off as weak may simply be waiting for the right moment and the right unity. When Italy returned decades later with overwhelming force, it could occupy territory, but it could not occupy meaning. The memory of Adwa remained untouched. And when Ethiopia rose again, the humiliation returned full circle, proof that even delayed justice still carries weight. To humiliate an empire, then, is not to embarrass it. It is to limit its future, to force it to act from fear instead of confidence, to expose the lies it must tell to survive, to leave behind a truth that others can use long after the empire itself fades. Adwa did that. And the mountains remember. They remember the silence before the battle. They remember the roar when certainty collapsed. They remember the morning when Africa refused to be history's object and became its author. Empires rise. Empires fall. But once a people prove they can stand, the world is never the same.